The book of Breshit is filled with a number of deeply intimate moments, both between people and God. And this week's parasha, which in many ways is a transition parasha, it's transitioning from Avraham to Yitzchak, which in many ways, Yitzchak was almost a transition from Avraham really to Yaakov, who would take over as really the leader of the next generation of our people through Yosef, etc. onwards. But in this particular parasha, it's called Chayei Sarah, which literally means the life of Sarah, but it's this beautiful euphemistic language that the rabbis really pick up on for the end of the life of Sarah. But rather than saying, let's focus on that she died, let's focus on her life and the legacy that she left behind. And one of the things she left behind was a son who was in need of a loving, caring, kind woman. Fortunately, Yitzchak found Rivka, and they were a beautiful couple together. Now, obviously, there was still sibling rivalry with their children, Yaakov and Esau, because it wouldn't be the Torah without sibling rivalry. But the moment at which they met, because Avraham sent his servant, who was identified as Eliezer, to find Rivka. But then there's the time at which Rivka actually comes upon Yitzchak. And Yitzchak is busy out in the field doing something. And the focus of today is not only a talk about intimate meditative moments, that personal moments that we can have between us and God, but also what happens when a fundamental idea about how we connect to God, our idea of how we understand prayer, of how we understand a figure in the Torah, is based on a single word. And when we are not actually sure what that word means, going all the way back to ancient times, there's debate about that word. So what does that mean when we base so much on a single word that we might be getting completely wrong? So we'll dig into that word, how the rabbis have understood it differently, what tools they use, and when they also use tools that they're not willing to admit they used. I'll explain that when we get there. So this class is not only an exploration, again, of a powerful moment in Yitzchak's life, but also an interesting look into what do we do with a word in the Torah that is, what's the phrase, I think, hapax legamemnon, or something like that. That's either means a word that only shows up once in the Torah, or it's a name of a character from Lord of the Rings. It's one of the two. So thank you, Gloria. So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So the first place to start is with the verse. So again, Yitzchak is about to meet Rivka, but he is just, living on, he's on his property. He's settling down, building, an area, town, as it were. And the word that we're going to discuss translating, I did not translate. I wrote it in transliteration. So we'll come back to it. So go ahead, Gloria.
Isaac had just come back from the vicinity of Beer Lahai Roy, where he was settled in the region of the Negev. And Isaac went out lasuach in the field toward evening, and looked up, he saw camels approaching.
With his lovely wife-to-be. Now, I don't know if any of you, Gloria or Leonard, anyone on the call, is familiar with this verse and how lasuach is typically translated, but there's basically two translations that you'll find in either the Jewish Publication Society, the very popular JPS one, or the one that's in Art Scroll or Core and the other ones. And they're basically one of two main versions. One is he went out walking in the field. That was actually what I took out of here. And the JPS translation said walking in the field. And the other one is to meditate. The question is, which is it? And is there a connection there? So the first thing we're going to do is the oldest known understanding of what lasuach is, and it explains where it gets that idea from. Again, the word, and if you're comfortable in the Hebrew, I'll point out on the right, I don't know if I can highlight it, the word here, lasuach, hold on there, okay, so it's this word I highlighted here, it's the second line from the top, line on the far left end of the line, and it's 4 letters, lamed, samech, vav, and chet. The lamed here means it's an infinitive, meaning it's a verb to do something. So Yitzchak went out to do something. Suach must be some kind of verb, walking, eating, dancing, jumping, etc., like that. The problem is, again, we have no other word anywhere else in the entirety of the Torah, or we have this word nowhere else in the entirety of the Torah. We have words that are similar to it. However, some of those words are nouns, and the ones that are not nouns wouldn't be conjugated this way if they were in this verbal infinitive form, i.e., to do the action. So this word is not anything that we can easily identify or compare it to anything else. So the first thing the rabbis do is they try and compare it to a word that's similar-ish to it. So Gloria, I'll let you take just or Susan, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, it looks like, I was going to ask you to move the cursor, which you did.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
And it looks like a sin.
Mm-hmm. Did I say samech?
Yeah.
I meant a sin.
Okay.
The reason I said samech, you'll find out later, has to do with another language that I don't speak, but it is a sin. Thank you for that correction. So lasuach, lamed, sin, vav, and chet. So Gloria, if you could take source number 2, and then Leonard will take over. So this is from the Talmud, and the rabbis tell you what they think it means, and then and they give their source, or I guess a little background. Just the source of the Talmud is the rabbis say we daven 3 times a day. Now, the real reason that we have 3 davening times a day is because they correlate to the offerings made in the temple, which were really 2 times a day, but then they kind of finish the offerings in the evening. And the evening service, Ma'ariv, doesn't have the same level of obligation. So strictly speaking, we're really commanded by the rabbis 2 times a day, 2 offerings. But there are 3 times that we usually pray. So are there any other things that we can connect those 3 prayer times, Mincha, Mariv, and Shacharit? And they say yes, they connect each of the 3 daily prayers to one of the fathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So go ahead, Gloria, source number 2.
Isaac instituted the afternoon prayer, as it is stated, and Isaac went out to converse, lasuach, in the field toward evening. And conversation means nothing other than prayer, as it is stated, a prayer of the afflicted when he is faint and pours out his complaints, siho, before the Lord. Obviously, Isaac was the first to pray as evening approached at the time of the afternoon prayer.
Now, it's interesting. This is from the Steinsaltz translation, Zichrono Livracha, and Erzatzal, and the obviously there is quite a big jump to say obviously. So we today know about this afternoon mincha prayer, but what the jumps that they did is in the book of Tehillim, there's this beautiful line about praying before God, and it uses the word sicho, siach shelo, his siach. In other words, his sicha, his conversation. And in modern Hebrew, the word for conversation is sicha. Now, the infinitive verb for it, there's not the same word for it. So you're making a little bit of a grammatical jump there. The other thing that they do is, well, if we're going to assume that this word is connected to conversation, which it could be, it very well could be. It could be a weird conjugation of grammar that no one has ever heard of before, or since, I guess. But if he was in the middle of the field having a conversation, who was he having with? Obviously, God. So the rabbis are not crazy here. This is actually a very beautiful, valid possible read for a word we can't otherwise identify. And this has become one of the most popular explanations for what happened is he went out in the field to have a conversation, probably with God. Beautiful. Now, the idea that he was going out and actually doing mincha with Ashrei and the Amidah, that's a little bit of a anachronism there. And the fact that he established that we do the afternoon prayer, the rabbis aren't really suggesting that. They have this model in the Talmud whereby they have a practice and they want to base it on something in the Torah, called it an asmachta, to hang your hat on something. They don't claim that the thing in the Torah happened and caused, what he did caused us to have mincha, but they say, look, we have mincha, and the idea for it can be found in the Torah. It hints at it. Regardless, that's the classical understanding of lasuach, is from the word sicha, but again, it's not the same word and it's not the way one would conjugate it. So before we go on, Leonard, with the next source, any questions up until now? Beautiful. So there are 2 pieces of information to understand basically the next number of, by the way, many rabbis agree with this and rule that it means and translate it to mean have a conversation, i.e. pray to God. But there's quite a few other rabbis that take a very different direction, and they do it based on 2 pieces of information. And I'll let you take both of them, Leonard. So the first one is a verse earlier in the Torah. And I highlighted the word in English, and I'll explain why afterwards. But this is the story of creation, the description of the creation of plants. Source number 3, Leonard, please.
When no shrub of the field was yet on earth, and no grasses of the field had yet sprouted, because the Lord God had not sent rain upon the earth, and there was no man to till the soil.
Excellent. So the word shrub in Hebrew, if you look on the right, is siach, which sounds a whole lot like suach. So maybe there's a connection there, except it's kind of weird. Siach is a noun. It means a shrub or a plant or a bush. So what would it mean, pardon me, to turn the word bush into a verb, to go bushwhacking? Maybe we do kind of have an English like that, to walk amongst the bushes. And in fact, in a classical language, there was such a verb in Arabic. It's not clear exactly. The next source was written in 1863, so it's not sure when Arab speakers started using this word, but essentially they had a word, and it's not, if you look in modern Arabic, at least according to Google Translate, the word for walking or traveling around is not this word. It's like some rufa, something like that. I don't know Arabic. It'd be fun to learn, but there was an ancient word that was used certainly by medieval Arab speakers that took the idea of walking amongst bushes and trees, i.e. walking out in wilderness, and turned it into a verb. So go ahead, source number 4, Leonard, please.
The prophets and their disciples were accustomed to meditate on long wanderings from place to place and stays in the deserts away from settled places.
Now, while there may not be a lot of plant life in the deserts, there were certainly bushes and shrubbery, and certainly the kind of that Yitzchak probably would have found. So in Arabic, they developed this idea of their prophets, their holy people, walking out amongst the wilderness for a meditative journey. So there was an idea of a word in the ancient world that was connected both to plant life and to having a meditative walkabout. So it's not, I'm not necessarily, or no one's necessarily suggesting that the Torah took that word from Arabic, but perhaps this word from Arabic can help explain the word in the Torah. And that is exactly what happens in the next 2 sources. So Susan, you're already unmuted actually. This next source here, source number 5, I had actually never heard of Rabbi Yehuda ibn Bal'am, who was a commentator and a grammarian, as the next rabbi is as well. And he's quite explicit about his understanding of the word lasuach. So Susan, go ahead, source number 5.
Can I ask a question first?
Of course.
You said that you were looking at another language. Is this, were you referring here to Arabic or?
Oh yes, thank you.
different?
I had mentioned that before, is that this doesn't actually come up until I think the Ibn Ezra, but the way he explains it essentially in Arabic, and I guess for source number 5 as well, in Arabic, the sa of that word there, sacha'u, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, would have been much closer to a samech in the sources that were explaining this. That's why when I read lasuach, I read it as samech, because in the Arabic, it would probably be the closer to a samech, but in Hebrew it's sin. And you actually see this in the Torah, is the letters samech and sin are often interchanged. There's this whole famous thing about sibolet and shibolet being a code word into a city, because people didn't make a distinction between it. So there's a whole interesting history behind the letter samech, which is basically a circle, and the letter sin, which is like a bow and arrow or like a teeth or something like that, and how they sound the same but look different. So thank you for reminding me of that.
Yeah.
But go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking because I heard something on the radio this morning. They're talking about the tree of life. They had like a yard site service for it,
The
and they
memorial
said
of
that
it, absolutely.
Yeah, they said they had prayers in English and Hebrew, and I was thinking, it's probably not Hebrew, it's probably Aramaic, but they probably didn't know that the Kaddish is Aramaic.
Oh, I see what you're saying. For that particular service, they don't think about that. No, the Kaddish has a very interesting history there, and Hebrew was often influenced by other languages, and there are words in the Torah that are clearly loan words from other languages. That doesn't diminish the Torah. If God can use whatever words God wants to use. But again, the claim here is not that the Torah used an Arabic word necessarily, but it's that we can understand a word in the Torah by looking at the equivalent within Arabic, which in source number 5, this Rabbi Yehuda ibn Bal'am suggests. And he's in 11th century Spain. So we are going in relatively chronological order. So please.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot of these languages are related to each other. So I wouldn't accuse stealing it from Arabic.
And they
once upon a
influence
time,
each
there was some
other. They're neighbors. Exactly.
No, once upon a time, they were the same language before they. Anyway, from one of the bushes or shrubs, meaning he went out walking among the trees. So it is in the language of Ishmael, i.e. Arabic.
So that was how the rabbis talked about, but that's exactly it. It's connected to the word for siach, what we saw in Bereshit, but it means to walk among the trees, just like they use in Arabic. So he's saying we have a word just like they have. So a noun, bush, turned into a verb. Beautiful. Like that's the most explicit of this version of it. But what's interesting is you see the word, you see Ibn Ezra, who was also a grammarian, also in Spain, probably did have access to this Yehuda ibn Balaam and was influenced by it. But go read that very short comment. I'll explain why I did bring this here. So go ahead, Susan, just source number 6 real quick.
Okay, Lasuach, to walk among bushes.
So one of the things he does here or doesn't do here is he doesn't bring in the mention that it's similar to the Arabic language. And one of the, perhaps if you said to him, oh, how did you get that? He would say, oh, it's from the word siach, from the book of Bereshit. He wouldn't mention Arabic at all because even though Ibn Ezra was a grammarian, he wanted to try and explain everything within Hebrew, that every Hebrew word could be explained by only using Hebrew. Oh, this Hebrew word that you don't know, it's just a version of this Hebrew word kind of reconjugated differently. We don't need to look to other languages to explain it, even though Ibn Ezra almost certainly could have read and understood Arabic. So that's just an interesting, A, he agrees with Yehuda ibn Talam about the general meaning of it, but B, it's interesting because he probably, we're not sure, but he likely hides a little bit of his source material because he wants to raise up Hebrew as a beautiful, unique language instead of saying, oh, let's learn from our brother Arabic language, which today, that's a great resource. We have plenty of languages that we can learn from. But any questions?
To dwell on this a little more,
sure.
I know for fact that Ishmael would not have spoken the same kind of, if he spoke Arabic, which is unlikely because he's a brother of somebody whose father.
So when they say Ishmael,
it was not the same.
No, they mean two things. They mean the descendants of Ishmael, which again, there's a little bit of myth making in there. I'm not saying the Torah is myth. I'm saying the idea that Ishmael, his descendants are the exact equivalent of the Arab world. And for them, it's just the code word. But there are negative connotations in there. It's also just an easy way for them to just talk about, all Arabic speakers. Everyone in the Middle East who's not a Jew is a descendant of Ishmael. That's not necessarily true, probably not true at all, but that's just their code word for, like, today, someone from Saudi Arabia, some rabbis would probably call them an Ishmaelite or a descendant of Ishmael.
But the point I'm trying to make is that language would also have evolved over the years, just like the English we speak is not the same English that was Chaucer.
And the reality is, we could probably look at Phoenician or Akkadian, these other languages, and we might find more. We have that a lot of times. We have words in the Torah, no idea what they mean. Just look at an ancient language, you're like, oh, that's what it means. But some of the rabbis do that, like Yehuda ibn Balaam. And even Ezra sort of did, but he didn't want to say, oh, we have to look at these other languages. And part of that is because the Hebrew is the language that God used to create the universe. So how could it be that words that God created the universe with developed or were influenced by other languages? So now, again, that's a theological idea that developed later. The Torah itself never said every letter here is sacrosanct and perfect and don't change a word, and these words have magical properties, God created the universe. That all developed later under the mystics. The reality is the Torah, which I do believe was given by God to Moshe and Har Sinai, is still a text that was, can develop and was a reflection of the language and the history of the time at the ancient Near East. But that's a separate class in and of itself.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we're going to see one more classical understanding of it, and then look at how some relatively contemporary scholars have tried to deal with these really 3 different understandings. So Isabel, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And now we're still in the 12th century, but we're in France now. So we're at Rashbam, who is the grandson of the great Rashi. And he may or may not have had access to the other. We often assume that all the rabbis were like checking each other's blogs to see, ooh, did you write a new commentary on this? Oftentimes rabbis were totally unaware of each other's work. Sometimes they were, as with Ibn Ezra and Ibn Balaam, but some of them never knew. And if they had access to each other's works, they may have been able to respond and it would have enhanced them. But regardless, Rashbam did pick up on the etymological connection to the word for bush, siach. So he understood, pardon me, this way. Isabel, source number 7, please.
So he, Isaac, planted trees and looked to the doings of his workers.
Excellent, thank you. So what Rashbam read in this is not this meditative, prayerful moment, which means he essentially rejects the Talmud, but he was aware, even though it wasn't his personal business, that people who own trees and work fields go out and check out their trees and their workers who are working the fields. And contextually speaking, it makes a lot of sense that Yitzchak would have been doing that he would have been going out to his field and essentially working or managing it. So Rashbam rejects this whole meditation and everything like that and says, no, let's do something much simpler. Is he was just checking on his trees. And there's nothing wrong with that. Now, one could come back to Rashbam and say, why do we need to know that information? If he had this prayerful, holy moment conversing with God and then met his bride-to-be, that's powerful and intimate. But that's that he met her amongst the trees. Now, again, we don't know why every decision was made in the Torah. Maybe there was some important, maybe the fact that if he wasn't outside at the time, their meeting may not have happened in that way, and it may not have been a magical, loving moment. So he needed to be outside. So it just so happens he was checking out his trees. But Rashbam has, kind of the most secular understanding of what happened there. And then Isabel, I'll have you take this one as well. And this is the Malbim, which is an acronym for his name, 19th century Russia. So Isabel, go ahead, source number 8, and you can see him kind of hearkening back to some of our earlier sources.
During the time for afternoon prayer, he went out in the field. What this means is to be alone there and to pour out his speech before God. For it has become clear to me that Siyah refers to speech thoughts that shoot out from one's imagination while thinking.
And by the way, this is, sorry, go ahead, Isabel.
Yeah.
I was going to say, this is not my translation. I think that's a quite good one. But when they translated that phrase, speech thoughts, the word is hadiburim hamit chashvayim, which is probably would be better as like, thoughtful speech or speech, which is, our thoughts which are expressed verbally. But this person decided to literally just translate it literally as speech thoughts. But the point here is, as I mentioned, you have these interesting debates about what lasuach means, whether it's about trees and meditative journeys or checking on your trees. But here by the 19th century, and now we'll go ahead and Gloria and Leonard, I'll come all the way back around to you. And Gloria, if you read here, number 9, and now we're in the 20th century, a rabbi who lived into the 1900s, a Rabbi Baruch Epstein, in his Torah Tamima, and he, as most modern people have basically agreed with this version, takes the stand, please.
We have not found in any place that the word lasuach means tiyul, to travel about. Therefore, certainly, there is no meaning here, as many explain, latayel in the field.
Which means to journey or travel about in the field.
The rabbi's explanation is the only true literal one.
So right now, we basically are working with 3. One is two of them have him standing still. One is he's checking on his trees, secular. One is he's standing there speaking to God, religious, but he's still. And the third one is he's going about on a journey. Now, many of the rabbis suggested that journey is not a secular journey. It's a walkabout, which has meditative, religious, spiritual components to it. But here, Rabbi Baruch Epstein says, we have no proof that this means to go about on a journey. Now, that's not true. We actually have quite a bit of possible evidence that that could be the meaning of it. But he rejects it and says, no, the Talmudic one about Yitzchak basically doing mincha is the one. End of story. And again, that becomes essentially the fact that, or the idea that he was doing mincha and praying to God becomes basically the more or less accepted one, not universally, but kind of the more popular one. So now we've seen pretty much all of the classical understandings of it. So let's say that he was praying there. So what do we do with it now? So before we go on to kind of unpacking and how do we deal with all these different understandings today, there's one more quick source I wanted to bring in. So there's this incredible dictionary of biblical Hebrew called the full title is A Hebrew and English Lexicon of the Old Testament by three people, and their last names were Brown, Driver, and Briggs. I don't remember their first names. Most people just call it the BDB. If you go into any rabbinic program or any scholarly academic program, hand me the BDB, they'll know what you're talking about. And I didn't bring this earlier because it's 1906. It's a quite relatively recent explanation, which is that the word lasuach, it's a typo, that the actual word in the original version of the Torah was lashut. And the last letter was not a chet, but a tet. And I suppose, I mean, if you look at modern Hebrew, they don't look so similar. And I've looked at people who were at my class about the development of Hebrew. I've looked at some old versions of the lettering. They're not that similar. It's not crazy to think at some point in history, a mistake would have been made that kind of got passed down. But if someone made the mistake in lashut, which they say here in source 10, explicit, I cut it out. There are at least half a dozen sources where the word lashut means to wander about, no problem. But if someone accidentally wrote lasuach, you would think the next person would pick it up and say, I've never heard of this word in my life. This is a mistake. Let me fix it. So this isn't a great explanation for it, but I just wanted to put that out there, that is at least one modern attempt to resolve it. It's not a great one, even though lashut would capture the meaning that others picked up on. But again, now we're going to look at ways that contemporary, really just two sources. One is not contemporary, but then the next one is contemporary, how rabbis kind of resolve some of the issues here. So one of the questions is, let's say, fine, Yitzchak went out into the middle of the field to daven, to pray the mincha afternoon prayer. Why did he do it in the middle of the field? Why did he do it in his home? Why did he do it in a private, intimate space? It's such an intimate moment. Why did he go out into this wide open space with the workers and everything like that? So in medieval times in France, in the schools of Tosafot, which were the schools started by the descendants of Rashi, and they did a commentary on the Talmud, they have a conversation based on a law in the Talmud that one should not daven in an open space because they won't be able to focus. If someone is in a forest, they should try and go right against a tree, or ideally go inside of a closed space so they can focus. So why would Yitzchak have gone out into the middle of nowhere? Leonard, if you would take source number 11, please.
But does the Torah not write that Yitzchak went to daven in the field? That refers to Har HaMoriah.
Har HaMoriah. So
Moriah.
Har HaMoriah is a very interesting place for Yitzchak, because that was the mountain where his father almost sacrificed him. So you would think, why would he go there to speak to God? But the other interesting thing is that tradition holds, and this is where we're getting into midrashic territory, and that's been an interesting thing, is pretty much all the rabbis up till now have been trying to do a lingual study, a grammatical or etymological study. They haven't been going into rabbinic midrashic territory. Here we are, because Har HaMoriah also in rabbinic tradition becomes the site of the Beit HaMikdash, where God said, take your son to Har HaMoriah and sacrifice him. And then at the last moment, no human will ever be sacrificed, period. Certainly not here. Sacrifice an animal here. So the first animal to be sacrificed by a Jew or an Israelite or a Hebrew on the Temple Mount in the temple was Avraham, when he sacrificed the ram there. So it's a beautiful, full circle there. So that location there may have been the source of the site of one of Yitzchak's greatest potential traumas, but it also becomes one of the holiest sites, and still is the holiest site in entire religion. And it is one of the key places where we connect to God. So we're making a lot of assumptions about what Yitzchak knew and did not know. However, for Tosafot, of course he went out there because it was where the Beit HaMikdash would be built. Now again, there's not a lot of evidence for it being there, but this is the rabbis trying to say, okay, we accept your translation of it means to daven, but why on earth would he be doing it there? And then this last source here, which is a really nice one. So it's a contemporary rabbi. He wrote this piece Well, what are we in? 5782, so 12 years ago. And it brings the source there from yeshiva.co, which has some really great articles on everything like that. And he makes a connection here between the idea of this meditative prayer connecting to God and the fact that the word still sounds like plants. And that's something that the rabbis clearly were kind of trying to figure out. And again, Arabic helped because they developed a word where if you're walking amongst the plants, we'll say you're plant walking, or again, bushwhacking, or whatever it is. And the rabbis struggled with that because we didn't have any other usage of that. So Rabbi Hanan Morrison takes a crack at it beautifully. The word lasuach sheds a unique light on the concept of prayer. By using a word that also means plant, siach, as we saw earlier in Breshit, in creation, the Torah so he's making a claim here about what the Torah might be doing when it creates this word. The Torah is associating the activity of prayer to the natural growth of plants and trees. Through prayer, the soul flowers with new strength. It branches out naturally with inner emotions. These are the natural effects of prayer, just as a tree naturally flowers and sends forth branches. Now, did he really want to claim this is the etymological basis for the word, and this is clearly the meaning of what the Torah meant? Maybe. It's entirely possible. It's a beautiful explanation. But it's so interesting for us is it's not enough for us to just figure out the etymological, to find out, the root of the word and connect it to other languages. The meaning and how it's used is just as important. And what we've been able to see here is the fact that the word has several possible meanings doesn't take away from it at all. In fact, as Rabbi Hanan Morrison says so beautifully, it kind of enhances it, because a single word can capture so many ideas. This meditation, being part of nature, growing like a plant, conversing with God, all of those things are captured in one word. So in some ways, it's better that we don't know how to translate it, because if one is going to connect to God in the vastness of wilderness, could we really capture that in a single word?